Let's walk through some of the concepts that did seem to work at some level, even though Kyoto Protocol as a whole is generally considered a failure. So this idea of climate clubs, I think, is another idea by Nordhaus in terms of saying why they are needed for success. So the horizontal axis here shows dialogue and implementation from this end to this end, and then on this axis we have levels going from projects sectoral to national and global. So climate clubs are basically some kind of alliances at some scale, from project scale to global scale, and they include on these high ends entities like G20, countries, G8, the more economically well off with some political considerations involved, of course, and MEF. These are political dialogue kind of clubs, so they are more dialogue forums, but nonetheless they offer specific platforms to bring up issues that now always include something about climate and energy and emissions and so on. So you cannot have these meetings anymore without having climate as part of the dialogue. Technical dialogues here on M and MRV, so I won't go through these acronyms. You can look them up. But there are these lead environmental certification, Energy Plus. Red is of course the reduced emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. Now there is also Red Plus and global greenhouse gas initiatives. So these are country level strategy implementations, and there are also implementation groups and project implementation groups and so on. The idea is that something like Kyoto Protocol, which was a global negotiation and split the countries into Annex 1 and other countries. So there was an idea of doing responsibility but differentiated responsibility, giving credence to the fact that some countries have been majorly responsible for climate change so far. So allowances were made for efforts, actions by the non-annex countries. So obviously annex countries involved all the rich countries. So the idea is that even though the big negotiation with its top-down mandates and expectations and so on may work better at local levels as dialogues or implementations, exchange of technologies, intellectual properties, and so on, if there are climate clubs. So some people like Nordhaus, I think, argue that clubs are very good for accomplishing the ultimate goal. Because if you remember, climate change is always local. Sea level rise, temperature, precipitation changes, health impacts, everything is local. So all local actions heading in the same direction of reducing climate impact can add up, even though CO2 is a global issue. It's a global governance works better for it because it's well mixed and so on and so forth. That should lead us to the idea of the common good or global resources that are shared by everybody, like the atmosphere. We all breathe the air and it gets around. What you put in one place can get around depending on concentration and residence times and so on. Okay, so here is the climate action tracker from June 29 update. This is looking at global mean temperature increase by 2100, December 2018 update, and looks at where we are. So Paris Agreement goal is somewhere around here, 1.5, well below 2 degrees, as we always like to say. And the nationally determined contributions under Paris Agreement put us in this range. Current pledges and targets take us, the best estimate of warming by 2100 is 3.8 degrees centigrade above the pre-industrial level. So to go from there to there, you need action from different countries, right? So this climate action tracker tries to date them and says the vast majority of countries have insufficient targets that must be improved. So obviously Paris negotiations have to be constantly updated. Governments are scheduled to update their Paris targets by 2020, but COVID is now a huge problem. So we're at the end of 2020, and the climate negotiation process, which moved from Chile to Santiago to Madrid, obviously nobody paid attention because COVID has taken the humanity down to its knees. Okay, to keep 1.5 degrees centigrade goal alive, they need to take radical steps and halve the global emissions by 2030. 2030 is right around the corner. So if we want even a 4 degree C plus world, there are countries which are critically insufficient in their action, like Russia, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Ukraine, and USA. So considering the big emitters like USA, that's not good news. Less than 4 degree centigrade world, many countries would qualify as highly insufficient, so includes Singapore, UAE, South Korea, South Africa, Argentina, and so on. Less than 3 degrees centigrade, many countries remain insufficient. So 5 countries here, 9 countries here, 10 countries here, and if you look at less than 2 degrees centigrade, very few are compatible. Bhutan, very small country with a very little footprint. Costa Rica, Ethiopia, poor country. India, developing country. Philippines, basically a developing country as well. So this is it good news? Well, depends, because in India climate change problems are already here. Air pollution is a big concern. Climate change issues are serious. Agricultural issues could become serious, and so on. So being compatible with 2 degrees C doesn't mean it can rest easy. It needs its own climate actions, renewable energy, because it's energy dependent on our imports. Vulnerability of neighboring countries would make it very vulnerable for its goal of growing economically at 10% every year, its ambition. So less than 1.5 degrees centigrade, only Morocco and Gambia come in here. Much less than 1.5, nobody. Okay, that's kind of a rating that gives you a sense. Also, it says why international cooperation is desperately required. Global inequity in the responsibility for climate change and the burden of its impacts. Countries with emissions in the highest quintile and vulnerability in the lowest quintile are shown in the dark red in the figure we will look here. Okay, so the dark reds can be considered basically as climate free riders, and you'll be surprised who qualifies for that. And those countries with emissions in the lowest quintile and vulnerability in the highest quintile are shown in dark green. Those are climate forced riders. Intermediate levels of equity are shown in graduating colors, with countries in yellow producing GHG emissions concomitant with their vulnerability to the resulting climate change. If a country is emitting certain amount of greenhouse gases and its vulnerability is basically compatible with its emissions, then it's shown in yellow. It's good to know who those countries are, right? Obviously it'll turn out to be in Africa and Asia and one in South America. So the scale here is showing emission level going from low to acute, and the climate change vulnerability is shown on the horizontal axis going from low to acute. So the forced riders are in this corner here, like the countries in Africa, South America, and up here in Western Asia. Okay, so you can see that these here are considered free riders because their emission is very high and their vulnerability is very low. I think you know what the concept of free rider is. When you have global commons like the atmosphere, the ocean, and air quality and health and so on, free riders are those who are not doing enough for the level of exploitation of the common goods they are doing. Comes from the idea of course, the Tragedy of the Commons from the 60s by Holden and Ulrich, which says if there is a pasture and several farmers are sharing it for grazing their cattle, there is no restriction on how many cattle each person can have. Then they keep using the pasture till they actually all run out of hay or grass to feed the cattle. So this is the so-called tragedy of the commons. And when you have global commons like the atmosphere and the ocean, you have to look for possibilities of global tragedies of commons. And free riders are those who do not follow the norms of sharing the resources or pay the price for it, and so on. So it's a shame that rich countries end up being here. China also fits in here, but also the Middle Eastern countries which are rich with oil, and Australia, of course. So this is for 2010 and this is for 2030. So these yellow colors are countries which are emitting at a level which is consistent with their vulnerability, as you can see. Doesn't mean their emissions are low. It's just that the emission can be high and vulnerability can also be high. Okay, so nonetheless, their vulnerability is compatible with their emissions. By 2030, you can see there are some changes. So these red colors here expand a little bit. Unfortunately, they don't even reduce. So the rich countries in Europe and North America and South America and Asia and the Middle East and Australia continue to be free riders, and there are many of the forced riders, countries which have no agency, no ability, no autonomy to control global climate enough to reduce their vulnerability or increase their emissions to protect themselves. Okay, so that's a very good map. I love this map. Just to continue this a little bit, these are kind of the common goods, exhaustible resources like fossil fuels, forests, water, land, atmosphere, social commons, and oceans. So World Heritage sites and cultural exchange spots and so on. So this site here also offers some ideas on maintaining global prosperity and human well-being. We need a technological, social, and political transformation. We have talked about science transformation, technological transformation, and social transformations already, including religion and ethics. So that is needed to establish sustainable governance of global commons. Okay, there are three aspects that make it inherently difficult. First is that global commons are either outside national jurisdiction, or their conservation and sustainable use conflicts with the national sovereignty and regulation. Their use may affect different levels of governance in distinct ways, often requiring global cooperation. So there is the need for global cooperation to manage these sustainably and avoid total disaster. Second, global commons also interact with one another, i.e., management of one common will most likely impact the use of others, thereby making effective governance a complex task. So aquaculture, for example, or even free international waters or exploitation of fish and so on, they are not just one issue problems. If you constrain fishing, there is a whole fisheries industry, employment on ships, in processing, in canning, and so on, that affect food security and financial security, job security of many countries. Thirdly, the implementation of policies to govern global commons will conflict significantly with existing patterns of resource use, sovereignty rights, and related well-established interests. So global commons are a serious problem which cannot be ignored, and yet they pose serious challenges for global governance, and they need a kind of thinking where enlightened self-interest, co-benefits, mutual benefits, and so on. Co-benefits means you improve air quality and your health, productivity, and economic growth improves. Mutual benefit means if India makes the region, for example, mitigates climate change in the region, then Bangladesh benefits, then let's say Pakistan, Nepal, and Burma also benefit. This will give regional stability, which can potentially benefit India's economic aspirations. Okay, so these are kind of challenges that are involved in managing global commons.